Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where we reach you. Very warm welcome to this session of Global Talks here at the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria. My name is Oliver Schmidtke, and I have the pleasure of directing the Center for Global Studies and leading you into the discussion and presentation of the UNESCO Chair in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education. And I'm very thrilled to have Rajesh Tandon and Bud Hall today here with Maeva Gauthier to introduce this chair that has joined the Center for Global Studies a while ago, and we're thrilled to have them in our community and draw on their expertise when it comes to community-based research and share with them the fabulous work that they do around the world. So my role today is, first of all, to let you know about how we're going to proceed. We would like to ask you, while the presentations goes on, to keep your mics off and muted and your cameras off. And then in the Q&A session, we're going to invite you back in also with your cameras and mics if you'd like, or you can use the chat button to share your thoughts, your questions with us. We will have presentations roughly, I think, for 40 minutes or 45 minutes, and then we're going to move into the Q&A session. So there will be plenty of time to engage with our distinguished speakers today. Sorry, before we start off, let me acknowledge with respect to the Kwangn peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Sangis, Esquimalt, and the Sanish peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. While we are meeting virtually, I think it is important to acknowledge, where the University of Victoria is based and our responsibility for those who came long before us here and who've taken ownership of this land for centuries, and we being guests on their unceded territory here on the west coast of Canada. So with this, let me very briefly introduce our two speakers, and then I introduce also then Maeva as the moderator for this session. So let me start off with Bud Hall, my distinguished colleague here at the University of Victoria. Dr. Bud Hall is a professor emeritus of the School of Public Administration, where he used to teach community development, and he also was the co-founder or the founder of the Office of Community-Based Research here at UVic, and a true leader in promoting community-based research at UVic over a decade or so. Bud Hall, probably all of you know him around this virtual table here, but let me underline of what an amazing international leader Bud is in promoting participatory research, community university engagement, and adult education. And I'm not sure, Bud, if this is, mischaracterizing your work, but I think at the core of what you do in your academic work, in your engagement, is to think about how knowledge is crucial for democracy, equitable access to knowledge. And with this, okay, it sums up, so that isn't too far off. So this is also why, for example, Bud thinks critically about the role of the university, right? What is a socially responsible university is one of the titles of one of the late books, recent books that he wrote in 2016. So thinking creatively about the role of education, knowledge, and how it empowers people in different communities, and what it means to achieve equitable access to this knowledge and empower people in this way. And for his fabulous work, partly for the chair that we're going to address today, but received very deservedly so a prize for community-based research, a leadership award very recently. You might have seen it on the home page of the University of Victoria, acknowledging what kind of path-breaking work Bud has done for promoting community-based research in Canada and beyond. And Bud has been a real citizen of the world, working in various countries, always thinking about how does a community-based research lens apply in particular communities around the world, from Africa, South America, Europe, parts of Africa, so all around the world, really. And maybe one last thing that I should mention here introducing Bud is that he recently won a new shared partnership grant for his project that is entitled Bridging Knowledge's Culture, the Knowledge for Change Global Consortium on Training for Community-Based Participatory Research. And here again, you can see the focus of his work. What is the role of knowledge, of research in empowering community, and how does it change in a way, how can we think innovatively about knowledge cultures? With this, let me move to Dr. Rajesh Tandon, who is both a distinguished scholar and also a real global leader and practitioner of participatory research. His life has been dedicated to thinking about how is the relationship between the researcher, the academically trained or academically based researcher, and those that are being researched, the subject of research, and thinking about how can you connect the world of research and the world of practice, political issues, social issues, inclusion. That has been on Rajesh's mind, and in this respect, he has been instrumental, and he has founded indeed the Society for Participatory Research in Asia, PRIA, that is one of the co-hosts and co-supporters of the chair, the UNESCO Chair, in 1982. PRIA is a voluntary organization providing support for grassroots initiatives in South Asia. And again, it considers how knowledge, also university-produced knowledge, plays a role in empowering these communities' grassroots initiatives on the ground. I should also mention that Rajesh is the chairperson of the Global Alliance on Community Engaged Research, and that he was inducted into the International Adult and Continuing Education Hall of Fame. So with this, let me just express my great gratitude for having brought your UNESCO chair also to the Center for Global Studies at UVic, and for greatly enriching our collective and academic community, scholarly community at UVic. So before we start going into the presentations, let me briefly introduce Meva Gauthier, who will moderate today's sessions. Meva is a PhD student in geography in the Community-Based Research Lab at UVic, and she's also a research assistant for the UNESCO Chair in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education. And on top of this, she's also a grad fellow at the Center for Global Studies. So we've had the pleasure of working with Meva for quite some time. And her own research touches on, and that also speaks to the spirit of the chair and its focus on community-based research. It focuses on adaptation, resilience, food security, and youth engagement, in particular in Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territory, where Meva works in particular with participatory research methods with the youth, the indigenous youth in the area, looking at issues of food security, resilience, youth engagement, and so forth. Meva is also the co-founder of Live It, which is the only Canadian company that offers kids, schools, and family unique online learning opportunities about the natural world. And here again, it is all about knowledge and how it serves and can serve different communities. And with this, I will leave it to Meva, over to you, and you lead us into the discussion. So again, a very warm welcome to our panelists and all of you joining us today.
Thank you so much, Oliver. And I'd like to also acknowledge that we have Niharika with us as well, who's a part of the team, and she is working closely with Rajesh Tandon in Delhi. And so, hi, Niharika. I don't know if you can wave at us at the camera, but I'm really glad you're here as well this morning and your evening. So I will start by sharing my screen, and I'll introduce a little bit more about the chair, the UNESCO Chair, and what we do and the history behind it. And then after that, Dr. Tandon will continue the presentation. So there you go. Please let me know if there's any technical glitch. Everybody's seeing the screen? Perfect. So great. So the UNESCO Chair for Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education really focuses on knowledge, democracy, and action. And so in terms of the institutional structure, it's an agreement between the Secretary General of UNESCO, the President of UVic, and the Chair of the Board of PRIA. And it's renewed until 2024. And so, as Oliver mentioned, the co-chairs are Dr. Bud Hall and Dr. Rajesh Tandon. And here at UVic, we have office link with the CFGS, the Center for Global Studies, and with links with the faculties of Human and Social Development, Social Science, and Continuing Studies. And we report to the UNESCO Higher Education Division in Paris. This is a snapshot of the team. It's very exciting. There's well, Niharika, as I mentioned, is also working with PRIA and closely with Dr. Rajesh Tandon. And we have Walter Lepore, who works as a research coordinator. Suriani, she's the K4C, or Knowledge for Change Hubs coordinator, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well a little later. And Sumitra Srinivasan is the publications coordinator, because we have some book launches coming up soon for a new book that I'm sure Bud and Rajesh will talk more about today. A little bit more about the history. Bud and Rajesh actually have been collaborating for now like almost 40 years, which is amazing. And so this is a little bit of the history. I won't go into the details, but they're both very involved in participatory research since the 70s, and then the UVic created the Office of Community-Based Research in 2006, and then after that, the UNESCO Chair was launched in 2012. It was quite the process from what I heard with the UNESCO, and so finally in 2012 it was launched, and the Knowledge for Change Consortium was launched in 2017. And so the mandate of the chair is to build research capacity in the field of community-based participatory research in the Global South and the Excluded North. Also to contribute to international policy making in the field of community-based participatory research, and also in social responsibility in higher education. And the goal is to really support the attainment of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's various global partnerships in terms of intellectual capital. So I won't read all of those, but it's pretty amazing. Like, I've recently had the chance to be more familiar with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO in Ottawa. For example, it's been a great team working over there. And the global partners in terms of advocacy, some of the partners working with the chair. And so some of the current initiatives are the Knowledge for Change Global Consortium in community-based participatory research. So now have 23 hubs that are part of the consortium, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that today. There's the SHIRK grant for bridging knowledge cultures, the World Higher Education Conference in 2022 that just got postponed. So we're working on policy consultations and policy briefs in preparation for this conference. And there's the open science and the decolonization of knowledge, which is a big focus, and it really kind of working towards UNESCO recommendations for that. So the Knowledge for Change, or K4C Consortium, it's a global initiative of the UNESCO Chair, and it's under the joint leadership of UVic and PRIA. And the purpose is to train the training of a new generation of community workers and students in the theory and practice of community-based research. And it's also to create an international network on knowledge, democracy, justice, and equity, contributing to the UN SDGs. And so it's still happening right now. There's, I believe it's 21 weeks online, and typically there's also a face-to-face for residency, which hasn't been possible to do the face-to-face this year due to COVID, but it's going to come back again. So where are the K4C hubs? This is a snapshot of where they are. I'll let you kind of scan through a little bit. It's really exciting to see how many people are interested in community-based research, and also training new researchers in that field and practitioners. So now I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and Dr. Rajesh Tandon will take it on, and I will, Rajesh, would you like me to share the slides, or do you want to share the slides on your side?
Thanks, Meva. Thank you very much. And thanks, Oliver. I think, Meva, you share the slides. It will be a lot easier for me, if you can, please. First of all, let me just say how grateful I am for this opportunity, especially Stephanie, Oliver, all of you in Center for Global Studies at University of Victoria. I have professionally and personally had long relationship at the center, going back to the days that the L20 was being talked about before 2008. It was at Center for Global Studies that the idea of a leadership group of 20 largest economies of the world. So it's 2006, 2007 period. And why this is relevant at this stage as well, and some point in time over the next few weeks, we should have a chat about it, is that the movement that we are all a part of has become particularly relevant and critical in the post-pandemic context. And therefore, it is not just about sharing of knowledge and expertise globally, but it is also sharing of local innovations that are taking place globally. And I believe that the Center for Global Studies at University of Victoria, now that the chair is so closely linked and has a home there, can play a very important role. All of you in the center can support through your various networks, because the global studies programming in many parts of the world is not necessarily linked to the kinds of issues that our chair works on. So you can act as a bridge in the coming period. Several of you have heard this story, but I met Bud Hall in 1978, and we have stuck together delightfully and surprisingly. And PRIA was founded in 1982. It is February next year. We are going to celebrate our 40 years of journey, and God willing, inshallah, all of you should come and join us in Delhi for the celebration. In this presentation, I am going to focus a little more on the meaning and the work that we have done under the rubric of social responsibility of higher education. And what does it mean? So I have labeled it social responsibility of higher education, looking outside in. So I'm standing outside a higher education institution, somewhere in the barrios or in the villages or on the highway going up to the big campus, and I'm looking in. And so what does it look like, and what we can offer differently? Next slide, please. So much of the discourse inside the higher education system, among the experts in higher education, leadership, vice chancellors, presidents, networks of higher education, has certain components. That's why I call it dominant internal discourses. The first component is that everybody talks about universities have three missions: teaching, research, and service. And typically, higher education and universities get used interchangeably in the minds of people. Some use it tertiary education, but So higher education institutions need not be universities, but that's what the mindset is. And so they have three missions: teaching, research, and service. And so uh, basically what higher education institution therefore does is it produces knowledge and expertise which academics can disseminate to publics as part of its social responsibility mandate. So, you know, public intellectuals, nowadays it is very popular to have public health professionals and researchers come and give lectures on Zoom to all citizens about the virus and what to do. So this is, and then of course students are encouraged to serve the have-nots, those poor fellows who are outside the university, those poor fellows whose homes are outside the possibility of entering the university. And so they go there, they do sometimes they do literacy classes, sometimes they do some sanitation drives. Nowadays they do, you know, health education because of the COVID. You know, they train people, oh, don't waste water, and they sometimes they bring whatever knowledge they have to the young people in the communities, rural and urban poor communities surrounding the university. And so social responsibility is over. Experts in the university, academics give important knowledge to laity, you know, so from the pulpit mostly, and students are go there, and you know, some advanced countries and universities like yours call it service learning, and it is sometimes not clear which is more important, learning for students or service to community, and who decides whether the community really needs that service or not. And in some countries, you have compulsory program. We have in Indonesia, we have seen a compulsory program. In India, we have the largest compulsory program called National Social Service, which every college-going student has to put in X amount of hours while they are there in doing some of these social service kinds of acts. And the management and coordination of this students doing this business is generally, the service mission is actually generally captured or hosted, or I prefer the word ghettoized, in social work type of disciplines, because they are the souls whose heart bleeds for the community. And so typically, social responsibility of higher education, the mission to serve, is independent of anything that the university does for teaching or research. Neither teaching or research infuses much of service, and service certainly doesn't infect at all the curriculum, the pedagogy, or the content and the focus of research. So that has been the tradition. When we started working together around this, as Meva was explaining, and you know, I'm not gonna present you 75 slides, so I'm gonna tell you some stories. So Bud and I got involved in 2008, was very important year. 2008 is when the Community University Expo came to UVic. 2008 when I got honorary doctorate at UVic. So participatory research and my practitioner-oriented work outside the academia got some recognition. Thank you, UVic. And 2008 was also when Bud and I got involved in GUNI network, Global University Network for Innovation, a baby of UNESCO, which came out of the first higher education conference of UNESCO, which was held in 1997. So you may just want to think about that UNESCO talked about higher education internationally only first time in late 90s, not in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or 80s, but late 90s. And GUNI convened a conference, and Bud and I wrote separate papers on that, on the linkage between higher education and social development. And one of the arguments that emerged from that, and I wrote a paper on that as well, that a lot of questions or issues of social development came to the academic agenda through the work of practitioners, activists, and civil society. Be it human rights issues, be it gender justice issues, ecological issues, water issues, indigenous people's rights issues, migrant workers issues, refugee issues, people with disability issues. Take any set of issues, they became part of academic teaching and research only after the issue was raised through the work of the activists. Now, GUNI then decided two things, and both in those things we were involved. GUNI decided to set up a couple of workshops at the second UNESCO Higher Education Conference held in Paris in July 2009. And we, as part of GUNI's extended team, made the presentation. And it was at that conference that what to many of you and some of us may look like very obvious, but two revolutionary, quote unquote, revolutionary ideas entered the lexicon and the declaration from the second higher education. The first one was that higher education must serve public good. Well, not necessarily obvious at that time, perhaps. And the second, that higher education should recognize indigenous knowledge and its contribution in teaching and research. So based on these, through a process of interaction, the UNESCO Paris encouraged us to prepare a sort of an application to be a UNESCO Chair. And we are the first co-chair arrangement where it has not 4 legs, 2 legs, one in Victoria, where you guys are, and one here in Delhi at PRIA. And this arrangement itself was the first that UNESCO Paris had to deal with, because typically UNESCO chairs are headed by one professor, and its main job is to do some research and teach some graduate students. But we wanted to also work with practitioners. And community-based participatory research cannot be handled only through students in academia. So a lot of these innovations came around, and our chair began. But around the same time, GUNI invited us to be guest editors to a seminal report, the 5th GUNI report, called Knowledge, Engagement, and Higher Education, Contributions to Social Change. And it is that 2013-14 period that we began to construct a global network of people, like-minded people, who were thinking about linking knowledge production, higher education, and community-engaged social change practice. And this then gave us, Bud and me, greater insight and a broader connection of various community networks and practitioner networks and academic networks that Meva's excellent slide showed. So in that journey, we began to argue that social responsibility is not only served through the 3rd mission of higher education, that social responsibility should also be served through the 1st and 2nd mission, and in fact, in an integrated manner. It should serve through teaching and should serve through research. And it is on that plank that we began to then do further global research and advocacy in 2015-16. You have seen some of those reports. That the first study we did was on community university research partnership, which made it clear to us that a number of people were talking about co-construction of knowledge, and we wanted to explore how next generation was being prepared. And from there we learned that training in community-based research was taking place in 2 different ways. Students were learning it in universities and academic centers, but without much opportunity for practice in the field. So they had great theory, and they read all about Paulo Freire and Bud Hall and whoever else was important, but they had no visceral, experiential competencies in doing it. And on the other hand, practitioners in the field were learning by doing, but they had no opportunity to systematize and theorize from that experience. So it is from this realization that, as Meva was explaining, our Knowledge for Change consortium began to emerge. And each of those 23 hubs are a partnership between a university or higher education institution and a number of community organizations, civil society groups, indigenous associations, local governments, etc. And they are doing collaborative research, and they are training the next generation in order to find local solutions to sustainable development goals. So next slide. So from the outside, when we look at, when there is an external lens to social responsibility and higher education, then a lot of people think that, well, higher education prepares the new elites for public and private sphere. You know, it's an elite producing, reproducing institution. And that academic knowledge is produced in English language in many countries. In some countries, you cannot even, you are disallowed from using local knowledge. And these are imported concepts, big concepts, you know, but they are not something that is in everyday life of the communities outside the university. There is also a perception that, of course, these students come to nearby ghettos and nearby, you know, rural villages, and they come and do service and do all this. But generally, community people feel they waste our time. They ask the same question again, and nothing changes. Even though so many research and surveys have been done, reports are prepared, we don't know what do they do. In fact, the complaints have come even from agricultural universities, that agricultural university students come, they spend time in our agriculture fields, do research, go away, but we never find out what they learned, what they discovered, and benefited from it. So basically, there was and continues to be a disconnect between what goes on inside a higher education institution and what is happening outside. And for us, the impetus for social responsibility is to overcome this disconnect, is to make that relationship mutually supportive and beneficial, and of course, mutually accountable as well. So we therefore try to explain to people that social responsibility is not what schools of social work do. Social responsibility is where your curriculum and your pedagogy of science, of metallurgy, of chemistry is carried out in a societally engaged manner. And you contribute while you are studying to societal well-being. So you can do testing of chemicals in chemistry lab. Your students can also go to the neighborhood and help test water, drinking water, through the same test tubes, and show how what you're learning can be beneficial to the communities, and therefore gain their respect and confidence. Similarly, there may be spaces for community members to get inside higher education institution within the framework of lifelong learning, and possibly to bring some expertise to the curriculum as well. So next slide, please, Neva. So socially responsible higher education, therefore, for us means that teaching will include engaged learning from and with society. That your curriculum would include what is happening in the society, not just what is prescribed in books and theories, mostly published in the Western European, North American world. And lifelong learning is not a concept only for professionals, but lifelong learning for many publics from society. The farmers from nearby villages may want to have an opportunity to improve their skill set. They may want to learn digital technology in today's context. They may want to learn something about managing a small farm business. Do higher education institutions have space for lifelong learning of other publics other than their own faculty and alumni? So can there be an executive development program, not just for professional managers of multinational companies, but a further development and leadership program for farmers in the same campus, using the same resource that exists? Likewise, in the question of research, that research is not just a set of theories which are imbibed from the world which began with the universities set up in Europe, but theories which are used in practice, the knowledge that has been derived through the work of generations, not just indigenous communities and their knowledge, but also experiential knowledge, knowledge which is sort of grandmothers, oral traditions, etc. But this will require an acknowledgement that universities are not the only sites of knowledge production, that the sort of the formal research methodology that we have all been taught in universities is not the only epistemological and methodological approach to knowledge production and utilization. And this is how we introduced the approach to community university research partnerships, where you respect the knowledge that exists in the communities. It does not mean that knowledge is final and complete, but you build on that knowledge. You don't negate it. You don't call it voodoo science, and you draw what can be deployed from that knowledge in a respectful manner and add value to that knowledge. And that knowledge is used to bring about practical changes in the lives, in addition to writing in journals and presenting in conferences. So there can be multiple purposes to use of knowledge drawn from multiple stakeholders and partners, and therefore the enterprise of knowledge production through community-based research is a partnership enterprise. And this helps build not only local capacity and local confidence in valuing their own knowledge, but also in taking steps to use the new knowledge to improve the situation. And this is what we are learning from our K4C consortium, where action on sustainable development goals is contextually determined. Because you can have a theory of macroeconomics or microeconomics theory of a firm, but not all firms look alike in all contexts. And a family enterprise of a group of farmers could also be a firm in that sense. But our economics students don't study that because they don't engage with them at all. And therefore, return to this question of social responsibility, saying higher education is for common public good and not just for those inside. And therefore, those who are not inside the higher education system, how can they be partners in learning, in building knowledge, in accessing new knowledge, and in becoming allies in improving the conditions of inequality and injustice that exist around our societies? So our perspective on social responsibility, therefore, is very different than what used to be when we came by as UNESCO Chair in 2011-12. So now, as you can see on the slide, our major book called Socially Responsible Higher Education has been published. It has case studies drawn from 21 different contexts, which focus on these principles that I just highlighted to you, which are not looking at a ghettoized way of putting service in to help the poor and the needy, but which are using the higher education institutional mechanism to build partnerships both for teaching and learning and also for research and problem solving, including achievement of SDGs. So socially responsible higher education has a subtext, next slide please, which Bud and I call towards knowledge democracy. What you see on the right hand picture here is in Arusha, where our Knowledge for Change third cohort residency took place. There are colleagues from all parts of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And the second slide you see is where adolescent girls in a community of informal settlements and their daughters of domestic workers, they are mapping their community to identify unsafe locations, unsafe times of the day, unsafe behaviors. And they are co-constructing knowledge, which they are going to use with local leaders and local government officials and boys and men in the families to make their communities safe for girls and women. So this knowledge democracy basically starts by this assumption or this value proposition that multiple sites of knowledge, multiple epistemologies, and multiple cultures have their own knowledge traditions. And that's why our project called Bridging Knowledge Cultures, that different knowledge cultures need to be understood in order for a bridging and harmonizing and synergizing to take place. So what are some of the elements? These are drawn from some of the key lessons we have learned in preparing this book that all of you will have access to soon. And this has, the first one is that when we talk about decolonizing curriculum, all kinds of vocabulary is used, but in a practical way, we consider one way to decolonize curriculum is to make it place-based, contextual, linguistically relevant, and include learning and teaching together. And that decolonizes curriculum. It is not one curriculum produced in one university in Europe, which is universally distributed in all departments and faculties, but it are multiple curricula drawn from multiple contexts where local language and culture shapes what is knowledge and what is relevant knowledge. Then the second point, multiple sites and epistemologies and methods of knowledge production, knowledge validation, knowledge mobilization. The concept of validity is not new. It's not just a concept drawn into research from Western tradition. If farmers' knowledge was not valid, our grandfathers would have, grandfamilies, grand ancestors would have remained hungry. If our grandmothers didn't know how to do home remedies through herbal treatment, then before the advent of modern medicine, everybody would have died. How did they survive? How did they survive in conditions much harsher than the ones we have today? And so there was knowledge validation through trial and error, through learning and doing, through practice and systematization. And that process of validation continues for a large number of practitioners. If, in fact, if you look at what is happening to the so-called treatment for COVID-19 infection, it is nothing but validation of one method, then doesn't work, it works with elderly, doesn't work with young, continues. And it's not happening in the labs, it's happening in the real world, in my family, in my household, in the hospital, in my neighborhood. So the element of knowledge for change is the local partnership, which looks at the socio-ecological context and derives priorities for research and produces knowledge which is usable locally. It does not mean that generalization and universal validity cannot be derived, but it builds from below. And so build back better is only possible after the pandemic, in our view, if you build locally first, deploy local expertise for local well-being, and then take lessons for more wider universal. Knowledge institutions, including universities, are sites for solidarity, dialogue, and evolving shared societal values. They are not just training of economic engines and producers who go and make some money and livelihood. So the sites of learning, if you go back to history of those sites of learning, higher learning, whether they were in the tradition of Egypt or Morocco or India, China, these traditions always had that higher education institutions were inside society, accountable to society, supported by society, and had a very boundary which was not very rigid and free flow of community, their ideas and questions and problems came in and they worked together. And I think this is what we aspire, a view of knowledge democracy, so that challenges of inequality, climate degradation, and large-scale human rights violations and violence taking place around the world could be addressed. Mere political democracy and voting as a right is not enough. We need to vote with our knowledge, and we need to respect the diversity of that knowledge system. So let me stop here. Thank you very much, and then we can have further questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tandon. And now we will continue the presentation with Bud Hall, who will talk about another great focus of the UNESCO Chair. Bud, did you have some slides? Yes, thank you.
So thank you very much, Meva. And thank you, Oliver, Jody, Stephanie, and thanks to all of you from the center networks and from our own networks who have joined. Thanks particularly Meva and Niharika, without whom our work couldn't be done. I agree with Rajesh that the new interest, or I would say the more the new visibility which the University of Victoria, from its president Kevin Hall through to Kathy Krul, who's their advisor on international, through to Oliver, who's directs the center, is very much appreciated, and I think it comes at a good time. It comes at a good time because we are, we're in transition to this, as Rajesh calls it, the post-pandemic, which may be 4 or 5 years, by the way, and the build back better. And we're also in a world where it's clear that the knowledge, that the palette of knowledge, of knowledges that we have had, in which to paint to paint our survival as human beings, either from an equity point of view or a biodiversity point of view or a climate point of view or a democratic point of view, as opposed to authoritarian populism, that the knowledge base, which is essentially a Eurocentric base, is insufficient for us to survive. So we have to, like we've come in ecological thinking to value biodiversity, so we have to value the epistemological diversity. And if we can bring more in balance our sensitive, our appreciation of biodiversity to an appreciation of knowledge diversity, it will we will have cause for much more hope. And as Rajesh says, I think the Center for Global Studies, because of its it's really interdisciplinary and really substantial networks in so many different areas, is a unique space for thinking about new ways of knowledge contributing to our survival. So we work with we do advocacy work or policy formulation work along with training and writing and so forth. And I want to just talk a little bit about this particular initiative, which is quite an interesting one. And this is a way in which the thinking about knowledge democracy can actually be institutionalized and transformed into policy. And the context here is that UNESCO is in the process of developing what they call a recommendation on open science. For UNESCO, they every once in a while they will create, it's a very modest word, recommendation, but these are normative statements, and they create these recommendations in various fields of their mandate, their UN mandate. And they're now working on one, which is going to be on the concept of open science. And we have been working with them, working with UNESCO in order to broaden their concept of open science so that it incorporates some of the thinking that Rajesh has outlined earlier around inclusivity. So we've been working together with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO and our own network. Producing a brief which is available, Niharika may, she's been so good giving us all these links. Maybe if you can find that one, Niharika. We've done a brief called Open Science Beyond Open Access for and with Communities, a step towards the decolonization of knowledge. That's been produced and in all these different languages. And then last fall, we organized 11 regional, multilingual, global webinars, including a very powerful one, an Indigenous Global Circle on open science. And we now are part of something called the Open Science and Decolonization of Knowledge Network. Let me just go to this one. Yeah. So the vision that we have proposed about open science is to broaden the concept of open science. So on one hand, we talk a lot about, and everybody here is familiar with the concept of free and open access publications. You hear talk about data liberation and these kinds of concepts. It's an ongoing concept. For some people, that's all open science means, is just access to academic production of knowledge. We are calling upon UNESCO and countries to think of that science must also open itself to society, particularly to civil society organizations and social movements. And we also are calling for an openness to excluded knowledges and indigenous knowledges, knowledges coming from minority linguistic groups and so forth are critically important. And if you combine those three dimensions of openness, then you arrive at what we call a fair and decolonial open science with and for communities. As I said, the UNESCO will be is in the process right now of going through the kind of intergovernmental debates about the wording in the recommendation. And I'm very pleased to say that many of the concepts which we put forward, multilingualism, bibliodiversity, inclusion of indigenous and other excluded knowledges, many of those concepts have so far survived the examination and the debate by the governments. It still has to get to the General Conference in November, where governments will have another chance to modify or make some changes. But we feel quite confident that some of the key concepts, pluriversality, for example, instead of universality of knowledge, but a pluriversal, that these are going to survive, and they will be put into the recommendation, which will be signed off by 197 countries, and will then be, exist as a, as a normative statement around which we can mobilize. Then we've got something, it's like the SDGs. SDGs are, really have given us a lot of room for mobilizing, towards the achievement. This is going to be a normative statement, internationally accepted, around which we can mobilize for, for opening, for a new vision of open science. And so we have created a network to support the implementation and the deepening of all of this, which includes the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, the Knowledge Equity Lab at the University of Toronto, our own chair, and there another important chair in Canada, the Community Sustainability. And the network that will be disseminating, records and informing, the larger, basically networking with all of the different connections that we have, working on an open access depository, mobilizing experts and providing in-depth analysis for the, for the thing. So I'll stop my presentation there. And let me just, before we move to the I just wanted to say, before we move to the question and answers, I just wanted to say that, Rajesh did not speak, in his presentation about the actual, context of what's happening right now with COVID in India. But for example, that picture of the young daughters of domestic workers who were doing the participatory safety audit, most of those families are in very, very dire straits because they are no longer able to work with the, with the lockdown. Domestic workers, there is no, social safety net, access to health, even for the rich and powerful. There, as Rajesh has very eloquently explained in one of his recent columns in Times of India. And so the Martha Farrell Foundation, which supports, closely associated with PRIA, which supports gender justice issues, has issued a call for donations to support domestic workers. And Meva will put a link to that, on the thing. And so anything that, do take a look at that and pass it on to other people in your network. Any kind of support would be appreciated. So I'll thank Meva, thank Oliver. Always thank my great friend and my brilliant networking buddy Rajesh, and happy to to interact with all of you.
Thank you so much. I should have used this term, brilliant networking buddy. That sounds great. But yeah, Wazir, it's such a pleasure seeing you and having you again and presenting. Next time we make sure, we meet in person again. But for the time being, thank you for the wonderful introduction to this. Before I hand it over to Meva to do the discussion, can I encourage you to start your mics, or you can leave a message in the chat function, either your question or that you would like to have one, or raise your hands, and then we can maybe bring you in with camera and audio. So that might be nice to engage with us. If not, please feel free also simply to use the chat box to type your question. Miva, over to you, and you can lead us through the discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the great presentations on the UNESCO Chair activities, and I'm just curious about timing. How are we doing for timing in terms of questions for today?
We have until 10 o'clock, but 10 o'clock sharp we would need to end. So we have another 20-25 minutes. So perfect. I think we already have Tamara's hand up.
A question here from Tamara.
Great, thank you so much. As always, it's wonderful to hear from both of you, and with your experience in participation and that background. I have a question. As working as a professor in a classroom, I know that we often want to work in community engagement. However, as you know, with participatory processes, there is a capacity in building people's own understanding of the issues of ethics in working with community, in power issues that may be going on in community, and also timing as to when a project might be the appropriate timing. So if you have a classroom and they have only a 6-month time or a 3-month time, you're actually then in a community expecting them to be responding in your timeline rather than what might be actually more appropriate in that community. And also then, a lot of times participation works when you build trust, and there's not really a lot of time to do that when you are bringing students in without that background. Can you talk to how you might address some of those issues around ethics, power, timing in linking students to community? Thank you.
Rajesh, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can, but do we need to get more questions?
Yes, good idea. Good idea.
So that
let's get
other people want to comment or ask them, they don't get timed out.
Sounds good. Any more questions that we could add to Tamara's question?
Let me give a quick Tamara. That's a real question. There's no question about it. It's a real issue. There are 4 types of obstacles to this. One is time, how much time you have. 2, building trust and mutual respect, confidence. 3, the life of the community and the life of the students are not necessarily sync. You can walk in at the wrong time or right time. You don't have any way of knowing. And then you disengage because the students go on. Life goes on. The students move to next class. So this is a real problem. In fact, in our mentor training program, building partnership and working in partnership with community is a very large part of our work. And in coaching and mentoring, how to do that. And people have discovered different methods. One important thing is, I think this is what the Office of Community-Based Research in 2006-07, when it was set up in UVic, was supposed to do, is to mediate these relationships. So even this is a role we play in PRIA, for example. Now, PRIA doesn't have field presence in all the locations of India or Bangladesh or Nepal, but we know trusted community NGOs or local government officials in many places. So it is a common practice for us, for some university in Jaipur or some university in Delhi or in Lucknow to call on us and say, we have 4 students who want to do field work in a class where they have to do a research, but they have only 1 month. Where can they go and which community? And then we help do the bridge building. It does not necessarily produce a final result, okay? But it does 2 things. First of all, we act, and through us intermediation, So some of the efforts at the opening end and the back end are taken care of through our relationships. But students get a real chance to practice and to get to open their eyes that knowledge also exists in the community. And they go back with a fresh perspective. Some of their academic arrogance becomes humble, and they also learn a few skills in how to have a conversation with a community which does not speak in concepts in English language. So it is where the research project has a longer possibility. Of course, 6 months or 1 year, and some students can work in that research. They get to learn much more. But I think small efforts can be made without, I always say, let best not be the enemy of the good. In order to reach perfection,
that's great.
Let's not remain paralyzed.
Thank you so much for the question, for the answer. Oliver, I think you have a question next.
Yeah, could I pick up on one of what I found a very fascinating element of your work, which is the transfer of knowledge across different worlds, and in particular, the resistance of the global North really to even endorse particular traditions, ways of knowing, conceptual approaches from the global South. You could even, in my field, mainly, if you think of political science, for example, it's plainly dominated by mostly American, tools, that prevent also particular knowledges to gain prominence, to gain even acceptability in the academic community. Would you have any suggestions, or do you see particular ways of facilitating and giving more authority and visibility to knowledge from other cultures? If you think, you can think here in Canada, the gradual acceptance of some of the indigenous traditions and knowledges, that have made it into the mainstream, at least to a certain degree. But really, what we see is quite a form of resistance towards these other conceptual approaches and traditions. What could be vehicles in your mind to facilitate this process of opening up the space for more diverse traditions of knowledge?
Actually, both of us will have things to contribute to that. That's actually really is the focus of our book, the socially responsible higher education, towards democratization or knowledge democracy. It's first of all, let's remember that it's taken 550 years for a particular body of knowledge to spread the way it has. And so, and we know that it's spread, that Western European knowledge, has spread, has been part of a political project, a global imperial political project. So, it was moved, in early days, once European navigation caught up with some of the Polynesian navigation and others, and was able to move around the world, that that in addition to hard force, military, invasions and diplomatic, that knowledge, soft power of knowledge, and the replacement of other knowledges by a particular perspective on how knowledge is created, how it is used. That has supported, the emergence of the kind of imperial world that we're now actually suffering from. So how do you go about it? Well, I would say, first of all, it can start just by ourselves, by what we choose to read. So people can say, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't create a course, can't create a university, but nobody can tell us what we can read. So one of the first step is, how do we decolonize ourselves? That's, that's enormous. I mean, I'm totally colonized and I'm fighting. And the only way I can do that, two things: what I read and who I listen to and where where I try to gain new experience. Secondly, one can do in universities, as you say, in Canada, because of the historic, our context, the, indigenous or settler colonial kind of state here, that indigenous knowledge, the recognition of indigenous knowledge, indigenous ways of knowing is coming, and it will continue to come. But that's not the same as recognizing kind of the global epistemological cafeteria of knowledge which exists. But it's a way, it's a start. So in my School of Public Administration, we have a committee. It's called the Committee on Decolonization and Indigenization of the Curriculum. So far, it's all indigenization, but I keep coming back to them and saying, there's also, the decolonization. So those are debates which we are having in our different academic fields. Thirdly, are the kinds of things which Rajesh and I do with kind of international higher education networks. The book that we've created is a contribution to the global dialogue on higher education, and we try to get our language into let's say the World Conference on Higher Education, into the agenda for the International Association of Universities, into any space that will give us a little bit of room. We try to introduce this language, and we make it sound, I don't say it's just, we make it sound much more vigorous and present than probably it is. It's probably seen as fairly marginal. By the time you've listened to Rajesh or Bud, you'd think that this is the only movement that counts in higher education. Because we've learned that people will change if they think quite a few other people are changing, but they won't change if it's just some crazy person from the University of Victoria. The final thing is persistence. When Rajesh and I first started talking about participatory research in the early 70s, we were literally laughed out of. I was run off the property at Stanford University for my views in 1972. They couldn't believe how crazy I was. And I tried to teach this kind of stuff. I never was able to teach a course until 1989. And it was only because I became the chair of my department and I assigned the course to myself. So the fourth lesson is persistence, and change takes time. This is 50 years of working on this kind of participatory stuff that Rajesh and I have been working on. And now we're seeing it as, not mainstream, but we're seeing it as an accepted part in higher education institutions. And that's going to continue. And that's going to build. And so, that's probably a little bit more, it is happening. It really is happening, and it will happen. And there's no stopping it. There's a lot of bad things in the world, but in the long run, I'm a firm believer that we will eventually, that, as they say, the arc of change, moves towards social justice. I do believe that, and I think that knowledge, that the understanding of the role of knowledge and learning as part of this larger egalitarian, aspiration is real and will get us somewhere.
Thank you so much. Before we go to Alan Pence, we had Mahazan in the chat asking a question. Hi, Bud and Rajesh. Thanks for the presentation. How to ensure shared interest between universities and communities is always answered. In most situations, community sees university differently than the academics.
That's Dr. Tandon.
Well, that's true. The university looks very different for those who are out of it compared to those who are inside it. And increasingly, increasingly that divide needs to be bridged. And I think people like you and the work we all do together is an effort to overcome that divide. The boundary needs to be more porous than it has been. And that is only possible if we change the mentality of extension. Because universities used to think that they're going to extend their knowledge to the rest of the folks. Those who have not made it to the university, they will be extending it. But if they can see it as two-way flow, then the respect for university will become. Second thing that is important to realize in many of our country, developing part of the South, for example, that university education has been the route towards becoming a part of the global elites and disconnected from your own roots. So many communities are now questioning the purpose of sending your children to colleges away from their local society because they never return. They don't come back to serve the community. They go back and work in some multinational company. The entire Silicon Valley was created by 4 Indian institutes of technology in India, including the one where I went. Every year from 1969, every year 1,000 to 1,500 engineering graduates used to land in US. And that is how Silicon Valley was created. But semi-literate rural women do not have access to digital platform today. So many rural communities are now saying we don't want to send our kids for college education because they will not serve our society. So I think that's a question of curriculum, because if you teach what you teach, they become irrelevant to their society. If the hydrology you teach is not the hydrology their grandparents practice, then the kids will become alien in their own community. If the language in which you teach is English or French, not the language that is used, they can't even articulate their theory in local language for anybody else to understand. So I think universities have to look at themselves as to how they can bridge that divide, because it is in their interest also. It is not just a community interest, but their interest. I mean, there's a lot of debate going on in the pandemic period. Why, if people can study from home, dismantle these campuses, hand them over to homeless people. That's the debate going on. So this is what will happen, because if you don't show relevance to your society, it's one thing to say, I am elite, virologist, and I correlate with 5 other world's most important virologists. But if your department of virology doesn't produce answers to the pandemic infected communities locally, you had it, my friend, you had it. Because not just that you can say, oh, I'm using private money and philanthropic money and corporate money, I'm not using government money. It doesn't matter. You stick in our society, and we want you to look towards us, not look away from us. So that's the pressure.
Thank you so much. Alan Pence had a question.
Not so much a question as just a very sincere thank you to Bud and Rajesh for a very stimulating presentation, and an appreciation not only for the presentation and identifying, but the key initiatives underway that you're playing a central part with, UNESCO and CUNESCO, et cetera, which I think is very important. I think that this arc that you're talking about, is beginning to take us to some new places. So I appreciate the hard work that you've been doing over a long period of time, and for the presentation. And I'm quite excited by the possibilities, thinking of Oliver and the CFGS, because the Africa work that my colleagues and I will be discussing next week very complementary, and I would say, you know, a part of the same sort of philosophical way of looking at things. And I can't help but recall some of my colleagues, you know, echoing what you were saying, Bud, about being at Stanford. And, you know, I had a very heartfelt email some years ago from an individual, Bami Semenang, who was a child developmentalist who back in the 80s began to push back against the Northern perspective on child development, and referring to his own childhood, his own context in Cameroon. And at the time when I first read that book, I was thinking, I wonder, you know, I wonder how long, Bame, can you stay? You know, how can you keep this? Because I know there's pressure against you. And anyway, I'll share with you an obituary regarding Bame, and it's titled Staying Power. And Bame had staying power, and he managed to stay power. He managed to create a space, which now he's recognized as being one of the real leaders of child development theory and programs in early childhood in Africa. So it's a lonely road. It can be a dark road. And I appreciate that you both stayed on it. And that's what we're trying to do with the Africa ECD work as well. So I think it's a highly complementary fit. And over to Oliver, I think this is a conversation that for Bud and Oliver and myself to have, because I think that UVic really is at a moment here we need to seize. And with the new president, as Bud mentioned, and other key individuals, I think we can help move that arc the direction that we've long wanted it to go. So thank you both very much. I just wanted to say I've been stimulated by the discussions and appreciate your work and your discussion. Thank you.
I want to make a closing comment before I leave. It is important for us to acknowledge that Bud and I are not alone. We were not alone in the 70s when we were building the network of participatory research. We went around to look for people who were similarly crazy, as Alan would say. And we found them. They existed in other societies, other communities. We are privileged and fortunate that we have survived. We have been able to feed ourselves and our families, and that yet we have continued to work together and gain a level of global respectability today. But we every day acknowledge that there are hundreds of other people in every society who are talking about knowledge democracy, even if they don't use that phrase, who are practicing participatory research, even if they don't use that phrase. So that is important for us to acknowledge. We are not alone. We can leverage our journey to make visible their work, their voice, and their struggle. Our struggle is not going to be a global association of champions of participatory research. Our struggle is going to be a global consortium of local associations and struggles of knowledge democracy.
Thank you so much for those beautiful words, and it's a great way to wrap up this beautiful discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us. And I don't know, Oliver, if you wanted to say a few words before we close this session.
All three of us, thank you so much for a fabulous presentation. Best of luck, with continuing this. Staying power, that was one thing that Alan aligned, that's what you need. And you've proved this over the decades that you've worked on your file. So congratulations on your achievements. And also Bud's optimistic view that the arc hopefully will move towards greater social justice. And, you're an important player in this fight. And, what you've done, I think if you look back, already, what you've achieved, congratulations for this. And Alan, indeed, we will continue this discussion with your presentation next week, and we could strategize how the UNESCO chairs could really play an important role in moving minds at the university, right? And if the center could be of any help, more than open to do this. So thank you very much from my side.